Well, without further ado, let's turn it over to our good friend at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, Terry Murphy.
Welcome, everyone. The title of this panel is Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation in Action. And as Bill said, my name is Terry Murphy, and I'm the Associate Director at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. Just a quick admin, a couple details, because I would guess that some of you this is your first session. This is a hybrid event, so ergo there's been a bit of kinks as we try to work this out. There are a number of people that are sitting at the Moritz College of Law, but there are many people online, and those that are attending, we have a wide range. We have academics, researchers, legal scholars, mediators and facilitators, people representing police, commissioners, activists, students, all people who are very dedicated to racial equity initiatives. So we have a broad range of folks listening in this afternoon. And I suspect that all of us are really trying to learn, hoping to better understand and prepare for the design and the facilitation of such important work. The arc of this session will be that about half an hour, for the first half an hour, we're going to learn from these esteemed experts. And then we'll have about another half an hour or so discussion, some questions among the panelists. And then the last half an hour, we'll invite questions from those of you that are listening in. So if you have questions along the way, you can use the chat function, and Bill will be keeping an eye and sending me questions toward the end of the first hour. So in this session, I wanted to step back and say about 10 days ago, a series of symposiums started, and the first one was at Stanford. And there were a couple themes that captured my attention that showed up that day. For example, how long change takes, that this is a long process. It took a long time to get here, and it's going to take a long time to get out of this place. So the emphasis on time and healing. Healing was very important in that conversation. Healing from historic harms, healing from the legacies of harm, but also interrupting and transforming the trajectory of racial violences as well. And then this morning, there were several themes that showed up, but some of them included the difference between equity and equality. We just heard a wonderful session this past hour, or facilitation and ethics, power differentials, power distortions, the issue of trust. And then John Powell at the very end, just a few minutes ago, made this gentle appeal about inviting belongingness among us. So as a short frame to this session, whether we're working through a major commission, a task force, a project, or a broad-based initiative, at the state level, in a metropolitan city or small borough, whether the locus of our efforts is aimed at laws and structures, institutional and policy change, or community relationships, whether our task is to remember, to investigate, to bear witness, to research, recommend, or enact change, and whether we're focused on equity or truth, reparations, healing, reconciliation, or transformational justice, and all of the above, this work is potent. It's dialogical. It's full of potentiality. It is complex, interactive, it's embedded, and there will be byproducts and at times unintended consequences. What happens is rarely linear, nor can it be easily predicted or controlled. Leaders don't just work on behalf of these initiatives. Yes, they are representatives and they bring immense expertise, but they also bring their ancestors, memories, histories, their lived experiences, their languages and definitions, their insights and their positionalities into these processes. And as they offer shape to the design and the unfolding of events, they are at once being shaped by what happens. And then when meetings are made public, either virtually or in person, the public bears witness to the important wrestling that's taking place between commissioners or task force members. They also learn and become more aware of the complexities and the dimensions involved. And then they too are drawn further into the wrestling and in turn begin to infuse their own histories, memories, fears, needs, interests, and aspirations into these dynamic exchanges. So in all of these ways, the work we are exploring during this symposium places great demand upon design considerations because these efforts are so potent. These processes reflect the personal and the collective. They are non-temporal, and yet they're temporal. They're specific, nuanced, and universal. They are public and incredibly intimate. At the same time, a perfect design will only take us so far for all of these same reasons. Once designed, what happens inside is emergent, expressive, and wholly human, rich and vibrant terrain for us to explore. So the process then itself becomes the earnest work of truth, justice, and reconciliation in action. So I want to introduce to you 5 amazing individuals who either are or have recently been inside these dense and demanding processes. Roseanne Brewer, the Morris Alumni Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Minnesota Department of African American and African Studies, will discuss her engagement in Minneapolis's Truth and Reconciliation Workgroup. Juanita Freeman, Minnesota judge for the 10th Judicial District, representing Washington County on the east side of the Twin Cities metropolitan area, will discuss her engagement in ongoing efforts with Mitchell-Hamline's Truth and Action Project. Raff Donelson, associate professor of law at Penn State Dickinson, where he focuses on constitutional law, criminal procedure, and legal philosophy, will discuss his engagement in ongoing efforts with Carlisle, Pennsylvania's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Amber Johnson is the Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation Manager at the City of Charleston, South Carolina, and she will discuss her work with the city's Special Commission on Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation. Anusha Venkatraman, I practiced this 25,000 times. Venkatraman is the immediate past executive director of New York Racial Justice, the New York City's Racial Justice Commission. It was formally launched in March 2021, and Anusha will be sharing about the first phase of its efforts. Each panelist will share for about 4 to 5 minutes, giving us context, highlighting the work of their respective initiative, and offering perspective about approaches and lenses that were or are being prioritized. So panelists, you'll be spotlighted when you speak. So you're going to pop out on the screen, and in about 4 minutes or so, I'm going to appear magically on your screen, and that'll signal to you that your time is coming to an end. But please off-ramp comfortably. If you're in the middle of something that you're feel very passionate about, follow it through. It's fine. And then I'll make the bridge to the next speaker. All right. So I want to start in Minnesota, where 2 separate groups are taking on this work, the Mitchell-Hamline Truth and Action Project and the Minnesota City Truth and Reconciliation Working Group. We will begin with the government-initiated Truth and Reconciliation Working Group, which Professor Rose Brewer was a member, and then we'll turn to Judge Freeman's work with the Truth and Action Project. So over to you, Professor Brewer.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really thrilled to be on this panel, given the conversations I know we'll have. I'll speak a bit about constituting the Truth and Reconciliation Working Group in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It will soon be 2 years on May 25th, 2022, since the police murder of George Floyd in front of a local grocery store, Cup Foods, on the south side of Minneapolis. It's close to 2 years since Minneapolis became the epicenter of protest and resistance given that murder and far more. When might Black Lives Matter became the mantra, it catalyzed another kind of introspection. How does a city change? What needs to change? How does that happen? These questions have been on the minds of the Minneapolis City Council, and certainly Vice City Council Chair Andrea Jenkins. Vice Council Chair Jenkins had already received national attention after being elected as the first Black trans woman to a city council seat. On October 14, 2020, Vice Council Jenkins put forth the resolution to establish a truth and reconciliation process for the city of Minneapolis. There are 21 whereases to that resolution. I share the first two and the final whereas. Whereas the indigenous nations who resided on this land prior to the arrival of European settlers have experienced a history of broken promises, violence, deprivation, and disease. And whereas the city of Minneapolis recognizes that Africans were forcibly brought to this country, enslaved, and that the construction of race was used to justify their enslavement, as well as the removal of indigenous nations off their land. Whereas the city of Minneapolis declared racism as a public health emergency, now therefore be it resolved by the City Council of the City of Minneapolis, Section 1, a working group is hereby established that will be tasked with exploring the creation of a truth and reconciliation process, and that this group will study the meaning of reconciliation, research different group models of truth and reconciliation commissions, and understand the impact that such a process might have on the city of Minneapolis and its residents. I was invited to serve on the working group given my research and teaching as an historical sociologist and as a scholar activist in the Minneapolis community. My response to the invitation was not immediate. I was well aware of the difficulties of trying to catalyze change when the structure of racism and classism are so deeply rooted. I was also well aware of truth and reconciliation efforts that have barely moved the needle. Was this the right container? I decided that engaging in a serious investigative process would be important, and I finally accepted the invitation to join the working group. What was to be 4 meetings turned into 6 months of intensive work and struggle. The idea that the working group would meet 4 or 5 times to do the work was, of course, magical thinking. We did not know deeply one another's histories. We did not know deeply one another's names. The city itself was put under the hard, cold excavation of history. Indeed, the city of Minneapolis is located on land claimed by the United States as part of an unratified treaty made with Dakota communities. In 1805, Dakota leaders met with Zebulon Pike on an island at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers at a place of great cultural significance called Bidote. Pike was seeking to purchase 100,000 acres of land surrounding the intersection of the 2 rivers. Pike recorded that 2 of the 7 Dakota leaders gathered had agreed to sell the site so that the US could build a military fort. Many years later, the US Senate approved the agreement, and an additional $2,000 was paid to Dakota people. The agreement was not proclaimed by the United States president and therefore never ratified. Yet we, through incredible commitment, staying with the process, presented the recommendations of the working group to the Minneapolis City Council on June 30th, 2021. At the heart of the recommendation was this conclusion. The Truth and Reconciliation Working Group recommends that the city of Minneapolis move forward with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It is also recommended that the Minneapolis Truth and Reconciliation Commission maintains a scope that centers Black, African descendants, and American Indian experiences, and adopts the vision and essential practices detailed above. It was solidly approved by the Minneapolis City Council on June 30th, 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. We're going to come back and explore some of what you said and unpack it a little bit, but those beginning whereases are pretty startling and important for us to hear. All right, I want to now move to Judge Freeman. Thank you, Judge Freeman. I'll mute myself, and again, you have 4 to 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor and pleasure of being here on the distinguished panel of all of my colleagues, but also for this symposium. I have the pleasure of talking to you about Truth in Action. It's addressing systemic racism in the criminal justice system. And as you just heard, some of which from Professor Brewer, that was kind of the catalyst behind many movements here in Minnesota. Some of us, like myself, who've been involved in the criminal justice system for years and worked on various aspects of the criminal justice system, have personally known, observed, witnessed, or even personally experienced systemic racism in the criminal justice system. Undeniably, over the years, there have been some progress, right, towards reformation, if you will, or change. But without question, more action is needed. Many of you seen the bowels of what I would call the criminal justice system put on display when the world witnessed Mr. George Floyd murdered by then Officer Derek Chauvin. Following the horrific and unspeakable tragedy, a vivid cry of outpouring of the dissatisfaction with the criminal justice system was heard locally here in Minnesota, and nationally, and even around the world. We knew then and we know now, and some of us knew long before then, that real, comprehensive, systemic change is needed. That was what brought about Mitchell-Hamline's Dispute Resolution Institute. I'm gonna call it DRI because I only have 4 minutes. I can't keep saying that over and over again. That might take up at least 2 of my minutes. And its president and co-author of our symposium piece, Sharon Press, had a history of engaging in action following officer-involved shootings. In 2016, my former high school classmate was killed by then police officer Geronimo Yanez. That's Mr. Philando Castillo. The DRI helped run community conversations to try to move the community forward. But still in May of 2020, the world watched Darnella Frazier's recording of Chauvin kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The DRI felt distinct a need, a call for action. So this project rests on that as a foundation. The foundation is to collect individual stories of lived experiences from those who have experienced desperate treatment within the criminal justice system in Minnesota, and combine those personal narratives, which, as far as I know, has not been done before, with the data. An advisory committee was formed of a cross-section of our community members, leaders in the legal profession, prosecutors, defense attorneys, government entity representatives, professors, county attorneys, judges like myself, and others. A Truth in Action project was created under this system of transitional justice. It relies on the foundation that reform and reconciliation are not possible without first understanding the truth. So our intent in this project is to put that truth into action later, but we must start with the truth. This is critical for those of us who've been involved in the system. If you don't know this by now, let me tell you, if data alone could make change, we would have gotten changed a long time ago, because the data is what it is, and we've consistently seen it. So thus, it can't be data alone as the impetus for change. Instead, we must have that truth come to light with the data and then act upon it. So at the initial phases of our project thus far, we created an advisory committee that I've already spoken of, and then work groups, 3 of them thus far: community engagement, data collection, and story collection. The community engagement subcommittee started to develop our outreach plan. We held 4 community listening sessions thus far. They listened to the community about input on how we can actually start making some changes. There were some obstacles, right? Global pandemic, major obstacle on getting people to participate, to come. Virtually is not the same as sitting down and being able to rap with somebody and build that relationship. And so we're now shifting, going backwards to one-on-one conversations, and hopefully getting the assistance from advisory board members to reach out to their network and then have conversations one-on-one and bring people together that way. The story collection work group has developed a process by which stories will be gathered, they're analyzed, and then subsequently retained. We also have understood very clearly that this is all very traumatic, and telling a story is very traumatic, and reliving that is very traumatic. So we put in as a key focus, making sure that the story collection process is culturally appropriate, respectful, and trauma focused, to make sure we are giving people the needs that they need to have following providing their story. Lastly, the data collection work group. We're not reinventing the wheel here, people. The data is out there. The research has been done. This is not a research project. Instead, we are going to our resources and gathering that information and putting it in a way that makes sense, focusing mostly on the Twin Cities area, which is St. Paul and Minneapolis for the greater part of our actual work thus far, which is Hennepin and Ramsey County. Again, the pandemic has caused us some delay. So we've learned that we have to be patient in this process. We hope to be, I think, further along than what we are, but it's been difficult to get the information for the data purposes and then also to build the relationship that's necessary to start telling the stories. We also want to make sure that we have the trauma resources in place. So scheduling has also been an obstacle in this pandemic, but understand that we've had some positive strides. There's been even some convictions as we've seen local initiatives, but then there's setbacks, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back with the tragic shooting of Amir Locke during the execution of a no-knock search warrant. So there is still much work to be done. And as we ended our piece, or at least our draft of our piece, I'll say in closing, until the system changes, we must not stop.
Thank you, Judge Freeman. And we're going to come back to the story piece, and because in observing several of the commissions, our initiatives around the country, this issue around evidence and facts versus story and how to bring a report alive, everyone seems to be struggling with this. All right, so the evidence is there. The evidence is clear. The facts are clear. That's not enough. So I want to come back, and we will come back in a few minutes to you. And I want to unpack your paradigm, or the way in which you're approaching storytelling even more, investigate it even further, because I think there's a lot we can learn from your process. All right, now we're going to move from Minnesota, and we're going to visit with 3 individuals engaged with government initiated commissions, each doing their work in communities which are fundamentally distinct from each other. So first we'll turn to Professor Donaldson in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, then we'll go to Amber Johnson in Charleston, South Carolina, and then finally we'll go to Anusha. So let's start off with Professor Donaldson.
Hello. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm so pleased to kind of share what we're doing here in Carlisle with you all, and to learn from you about the work that you've done. So my work on the Carlisle Borough Truth and Reconciliation Commission in some ways feels like it's just begun. So our commission is a product of a resolution by our local town borough council. I think I should say just a little about our town. We're a small left-leaning college town, which is also the county seat in a very right-leaning county in central Pennsylvania. The population is about 20,000, and while it is decidedly more diverse than the surrounding area, it is still a predominantly white town, save for its large and impermanent population, that of the Army War College, Dickinson College, and Penn State Dickinson Law, which is where I work. Now, our charge is to develop a report which will document historic and present racial injustices, and to make policy recommendations to our borough council. Among the many injustices that we are to detail include Carlisle's unfortunate role in genocidal policies against Native Americans in hosting the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was an assimilationist project that was begun in 1879, and it lasted through the end of the First World War. In addition to that, and I'll talk more about this later, a catalyst for the formation of our commission were those police officer involved killings of Black people in 2020. So for that reason, we're also seeking to investigate various forms of anti-Black injustice, particularly state-sponsored ones, but not only those. My own service on the commission began just May 2021, and according to the resolution which created our commission, our project will end in December of this year. That is an extremely short amount of time, though it is a year and a half. In the time that we've had together, we are still kind of in the middle of so much. And I don't yet feel like I'm at the point where I can talk about kind of what all we will propose to do and what all we have documented. But I will talk about just some of the projects that we have been engaged in recently, and then close and turn to the next person. So one of the things that we've been doing is trying to gather local information, trying to gather local stories, as the judge just mentioned. So one of the events that we've been doing is an event called Thinking About Race Thursdays, where we meet in a place in the community, different places each month, one Thursday, to invite people to tell stories about injustices or at least uneasiness that they felt around race in the community. We've also interviewed people in the police department to better understand their policies. One thing that we have noted being in such a small town, unlike some of the larger places, is that there's actually not a lot of data that is collected by police departments in really small towns. So I'm a person, I wouldn't go as far as calling myself a policing scholar, but I've written a lot about police and I teach about police investigations. And one thing that I note from kind of thinking about how we usually think about how police departments work, how small towns work is often very different. There's just a dearth of data about all sorts of decisions that are made, and lots of things are rather ad hoc. And so it's actually hard to document kind of where the problem lies. There's certain citizens who feel like they are unfairly policed, but there's not even records about how patrolling decisions are made in our town. Finally, we've been meeting with our local Chamber of Commerce. Similar type of story there. Minority-owned businesses and business leaders often feel like there is prejudice against them, but there's not a lot of data documenting exactly what their plight is. And so we've been trying to amass this data, because though it exists on the national level, for really small towns, often such data is missing. And so we would like to kind of amass that data so that we can then make recommendations to a borough council that will be well supported by evidence. And that's what we're up to so far.
Wonderful, Raff. Thank you so much. And it's been really lovely watching your commission evolve. It didn't start with a lot of structure on the front end, and yet you have intuitively found the kind of questions that you really need to wrestle with. One of which is, how much money should we be spending on research? Because we already know the evidence is out there. So, just listening to that wrestle, but it is a unique context, a small town. And yet your group has been earnest in its pursuit. And so congratulations to you. All right, let's move on now to Amber Johnson.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to share Charleston's story with all of you. Our story started before we even thought about a commission. After the murders at Mother Emanuel's Church, our city was forced to start to have conversations about race. Our police department started with several projects. And then one of our community organizations came to the city with the recommendation that the city apologize for its role in slavery. In a very close vote, 7-6, the city voted to apologize for slavery. And part of that apology included the creation of my position as the Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation Manager for the city. They brought me on. So the apology was in 2018. They brought me on in 2019. And then in 2020, after George Floyd, the city was, again, after protest, forced to have that conversation again. They created a special commission on equity, inclusion, and racial conciliation shortly after. And that group was given 90 days to come up with a plan, recommendations for the mayor and city council on how to advance racial equity throughout the city. We know that 90 days is not enough time to come up with this kind of plan. And it took us well over a year to present a report to council. As a matter of fact, it took us more than 90 days to figure out the structure and to select the membership for the committee. In the end, we ended up with 6 community members, 6 council members, 7 community members. And then those 7 community members led 7 subcommittees with 5 to 7 community members. And then each of those subcommittees were staffed with city staff members. So it was a massive undertaking with well over 40 people. They met a total of 68 times, and then our commission met 14 times. In late August of 2021, we were able to present a report to our council. That report was well over 500 pages. It included over 125 recommendations. We knew going into that meeting to council to present that report that our council had trouble with words like reparations, critical race theory, and then we had a recommendation to reallocate some of the police budget to mental health issues, which is, I will say that it's something that they're already doing, but the narrative for that recommendation became that the commission wanted to defund the police. So when the report went before council, it was a very tense meeting. At that meeting, there was also a mask mandate. So the folks who were against that came out, and then they talked about the mask and they wanted to talk about the report. So it was a very tense meeting. And it made it very difficult to have the conversation about the report and dedicate the time that it needed to talk about the report. In the end, our council decided that they did not want to receive the report and send it to our standing committees of council. However, our mayor received the report and he said that he would distribute those recommendations to council. So since that meeting, the mayor has sent those recommendations and we started to have those conversations in the standing committees of council. Also, because those subcommittees were staffed with staff members from the city, they were able to take the recommendations that didn't need to go before council and start implementing those throughout their departments. So we have started doing work on those recommendations that came from the report. One of the recommendations in the report was that we have a permanent commission on equity, inclusion, and racial conciliation. And because of the reception of the report, it became really difficult to get an ordinance passed to have a permanent commission. So it took us several months and a lot of negotiations with the other council members who were against the report and who were against a standing commission on equity, inclusion, and racial conciliation. However, we were able to come to an agreement about what a standing commission would look like. And in February, that ordinance was passed. So we now have a standing commission. It has a new name. It's the Human Affairs and Racial Conciliation Commission. But the hope is that we'll be able to continue the work that was started. Even if it has a new name, we know the purpose behind it. And so now we're in the process of staffing that new commission and then figuring out what it's going to look like and what the structure is going to look like going forward.
Thank you so much, Amber. Yours has been an earnest work, and I applaud how persistent the effort has been in Charleston. You have continued to push, and it's been impressive to watch. I know that the road has not been easy, so I'm grateful to have learned a lot from you and from this process. And I think it's interesting that one of the patterns that seems to be consistent across the speakers so far is this issue around magical thinking that Dr. Brewer brought up, is that you've been given these tiny, tight timeframes to produce something that's impossible with people you don't know and have not built and developed relationships with or trust. And so I think that's just something to kind of keep our eye on, is this issue around magical thinking. And Amber, when we start talking about structure, for you to talk about how the strategy of your structure, so that even though the report might not have been accepted, some things are still happening. All is not in vain. All right. So thank you. All right. Now, Anusha Venkatraman, How did I do? Did I do okay?
Pretty well.
Oh, no.
Anusha Venkatraman, so great to see all of you and be on this panel with such fantastic folks doing great work, actualizing racial equity and racial justice in your communities. So I'm here to talk about the work of the New York City Racial Justice Commission. I served as the executive director from the founding of the commission until just about a month ago. The commission was formed in March of last year, 2021, by former Mayor Bill de Blasio with the mandate of beginning to dismantle structural racism in the city's charter. This was a huge and historic undertaking and a great opportunity and responsibility for the staff and the commission. The city's charter is essentially the city's constitution, defining the powers, the structures, the organization of city government, the roles of folks in city government, from elected officials to appointed positions, and all of the procedures that agencies need to follow through on. And while the charter is an important roadmap for the city, it does not directly ensure equity or fairness in the design or delivery of the city services. So the commission was empowered as a charter revision commission, and early on, the commission determined that given that unique opportunity, we needed to put forward proposals that would transform that foundation of city government to make equity a central aim and focus, and to hold government accountable to that focus. I'll get into this a little bit later, I think, but from there, we really decided, let's focus on structural level change. There's so much that can be done at the agency level, at the policy level, but we have this really unique opportunity to focus on structure and beginning the long process of dismantling structural racism. I'll also note that early on, we determined that we didn't have the time and space to undertake a full racial reconciliation process in a meaningful way. We were formed in March and tasked with delivering recommendations by the end of last year, so December 2021. And we knew that really meaningfully engaging in racial reconciliation is a much longer process and one that should be ongoing. And so we sort of touched the surface, but knew that that's what we were not able to get into fully. The commission has 11 commissioners led by Chair Jennifer Jones Austin. Those commissioners really represent the full diversity of New York City, from the communities that folks are from, boroughs, the disciplines that they work in. But what all the commissioners hold in common is a really authentic commitment to racial equity and making sure that New Yorkers can live in a city that is fair and equitable for everyone. And that commitment was really unique, and it really has been a special commission to be a part of and to support, and one that's very unique, I think, in government. In terms of our process, we wanted to make sure that we could hear from New Yorkers throughout our deliberation, and that New Yorkers had the chance to participate in this historic process. So we held months of public engagement where we heard, the personal experiences, stories from people, their concerns, the challenges, their ideas, their specific proposals. For charter revision, in total, we held over 40 public meetings. That was in-person sessions, online, some panel discussions with experts in the field and other leaders. We also behind the scenes spoke with other cities to learn from them, including some folks that are here today. That process of engagement was incredibly important to make sure that we were not assuming things, but we're really listening to what folks had to say. And it was enlightening. We expected policing and criminal justice to be at the forefront and a primary issue. And it was, but what we really heard was that structural racism impacts every area of the lives of communities of color, BIPOC New Yorkers in particular. And so that was really important as we developed our final proposals. I won't go into too much detail into what those are, but we wanted to put forward proposals that would attack the root cause of those persistent patterns of inequity, including marginalization, segregation of wage and occupation, overcriminalization, inequities in health and education, sort of big picture things. We delivered those final ballot proposals to the city clerk's office at the end of December. And we really do think that those proposals focus on delivering changes to the charter that are actionable, hold government accountable, and aspire to a shared vision for what New Yorkers see for their city. So I don't think I have time to go into what those are. There are 3 proposals. One is adding a preamble or sort of vision statement to the charter. The second is establishing a permanent racial equity office, requiring a racial equity plan and a commission for accountability and community oversight. Third is a proposal that would establish a measurement of the true cost of living in our city. And in addition to those 3 charter vision proposals, we put forward other recommendations like continuing with racial reconciliation work, exploring reparations, things that would continue the commission's work. So if you want more details on those, you can go to the commission's website, nyc.gov/racial justice, and excited to be in conversation with the folks here today.
Yeah, and I would recommend that viewing that report. It's sitting right here with me. It's a fantastic report, Anusha. And just a couple things. One of this part of your strategy, after you listened, then you came back and you synthesized what you heard, and then you went back out and said, did we get it right? I really appreciated seeing that you tested, this is what came into our ears, this is what we think you said, but is this what you said? And then also that whole preamble conversation at the very beginning around what are our aspirations for the city of New York? And that was so important that you included the aspirations for all New Yorkers, not just some New Yorkers in the work that you were doing. So I thought that was really a fabulous contribution that you gave, hopefully in a vision to other folks doing this work, is to be clear on your aspirations. All right, so we're tiny bit, thank you all of you. I'm running ahead of myself. Thank you for presenting a quick overview. But now what I want to do is to move us into some discussion. And we have about maybe 25 minutes because we're a bit behind here. And there's several questions that it would be great to get to. So let's just kind of intuit the process and see what happens. But I want to start out with something that Professor Brewer raised when we met last week, is just kind of why now? All right. There are so many racial equity and justice efforts happening throughout the country. So in your opinion, is this a turning point in the life of your city or in the country or your communities? How do you understand this moment? Why is it happening? So Dr. Brewer, I wonder if you could just reflect to us your own thinking about this moment in time.
Surely, I think it's a very difficult moment. It's a defining moment, and there are no ready answers to any of the daunting questions that we face in this society, and dare I say globally, given what we've been experiencing the last couple of weeks. You know, there's climate catastrophe, and certainly putting a finer note on it, the fact that there has been a move to the right in this society, that white nationalism has emerged in the context of some of the horrific situations we've described, from what happened, of course, in my city to all around the country, whether it be New York City or Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or wherever. I want to lift up actually and honor one of our, what I call freedom fighters, Mel Reeves, who died just a couple of months ago from COVID, a fierce Black man who always asserted justice then peace. I think these are efforts at justice. We're not going to get peace in this society without digging deeply along all the parameters that have been described, and even more deeply. You know, so much of what our conversation was in the working group was looking at the contradictions of liberal Minnesota, lifting the veneer. You know, the day that some of the media spotlighted what was going on in the city, the Washington Post noted the tremendous racial inequality in Minneapolis. This has been something that had been talked about for a while. Of course, with the murder of Mr. Floyd, it lifted it up. But using 2018 data, median Black family income in Minneapolis was $36,000. White median family income was $83,000. Can you get more glaring than that in terms of why now? You know, the demand for me is to dig into the transparencies, to listen to people, but the reckoning, I call it the reckoning at this moment. So I know others probably have other things to say.
Right. So there were some triggering episodes in some of your contexts as well, but curious, open this up to a couple of you that, you know, why now? What's happening? Why do you think this particular, is it a turning, as Dr. Brewer said, is this a defining moment? Is there this possibility for shift and a true change? What do you think?
So I'm perhaps less, not as optimistic that it's a great turning point. Instead,
Not optimistic in the sense of it's a great turning point, but in terms of, I'm excuse me for interrupting you, don't misinterpret what I said. In terms of the horror of the moment, not the optimism, but the demand of the moment. It is a necessity. So I wanted to be clear that you heard that.
to be clear, yeah, as I think about it, there were historic protests in 2020. The number of people protesting was larger than at any point in the past generation. And so politicians seized on the time. Politicians, both those elected and politicians in the sense of activists, those who want to seek political change, saw an opportunity to do something then that maybe wasn't available 2 years beforehand, though there were police killings 2 years before that as well, of course. And so as I think about our own commission in Carlisle, the Borough Council saw this is, if we're going to do something like this, now's the time we have the political capital. And I don't know whether a report that is delivered in December and then debates on those things began in January of 2023, 2.5 years after that moment of political capital, what that will mean. I'm just not sure. I wonder, not to speak for someone else, I wonder about the situation in Charleston that was described, where there was an event that was catalyzing, but by the time you actually get to do the work, some of that political capital might even be spent by then. But anyways, I'm hoping, at least for my own council's sake, that people do remember the kind of anger and determination that they felt in 2020, and that can carry forward and make the changes that we seek to happen, make those be realized.
I'm curious, Amber, do you have any response to that? Because he did put his finger on, you know, you did have this catalyzing event take place, and then in seeing what's happened in the, you know, the subsequent years after the apology. So where do you land on this?
I think for us, it's not something that's going away. It's something that we'll always remember. We're all connected to what happened at Mother Emanuel. We all know somebody who knows somebody. We're all connected in that way to that tragedy. So it's not something that we're ever going to forget. I drive by the church as I go to work. So it's there, it's in our face, and we know that what happened there, that it could happen again, because that kind of hatred is still there in the city, even though we want to pretend like Charleston is the nicest place in the world. We know that it's there, it's underlying, and it's alive. So it's not something that we're going to forget.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move us on. and for those of you that didn't answer, feel free to come back into this particular issue if you want to, but just for the sake of time, I want to keep us moving forward here. I want to talk a little bit about wrestling. When we met last week, many of you said that there was wrestle that took place inside or is taking place. And I see that slightly different than a challenge. So the question is, did your group have a particular wrestle or a couple things they really, really wrestled with? And if there was, maybe name it. And was that wrestling turned into an opportunity for transformation? And then, but if it didn't, and it kind of stayed stuck there, why do you think it's stuck there? So Amber, I'll go back to you because I know there has been wrestle, but then open up to others where there was clear wrestling inside your commissions or your initiatives.
When I think of the wrestle, I think of the city like wrestling with itself, like its identity of like who we are and how we show up. And as I guess I stated earlier, there's a lot of conversation of like, this is not who we are. We don't have this problem. And so I think just having to really name it and saying like, this is here, this is a real thing and it's happening. I think it's created an opportunity to have that conversation, to know that even though there weren't protests after Mother Emanuel, people were still angry, they were still hurting, and that it was real. And it's not something that just went away, that people just forgave, even though many of the family members did forgive very quickly. People were still very angry. They still are very angry. So I think it's just a wrestling of like naming that racism is alive and well in Charleston and that it didn't miss us.
So city is wrestling with itself. All right, others. Was there a wrestle, a particular kind of wrestle that took place inside your work?
I don't want to talk too much, but definitely there was a lot of wrestling that took place. And, you know, when you're talking about broad structural systemic realities, you're really looking at a macro level, a big picture level. But when you get granular, you know, it becomes very evident that even within a working group, there are very different senses of what's possible and how people see themselves and how they see change happen. I think we lifted up the fact that even how we name ourselves was an internal question among African descendant people for a number of reasons. The diversity within the population, same with Native, and the bigger report documents some of that. And how do you name Indigenous, Native American, American Indian, depending on time, place, and conditions. So that minutia, if you will, it wasn't minutia. It was a source of a lot of coming to terms with who we are and why we are. So just one example.
Okay. There was a lovely quote, I think I mentioned this last week, but I actually wrote it down, Dr. Brewer, where in the report that was given to the Policy and Oversight Committee, I think the person was quoting you or summing up something that she really learned from you. And I'll just say it here, or repeat it here. She says, our stories are told through the perspective and through the lens of the majority and white supremacy. We knew for there to be a solid foundation, we had to self-identify based on our history, communicate from our perspective, where and who we come from, who and how we know ourselves to be. We need to speak for ourselves. I thought that was a very powerful statement she made to the committee, and she attributes it to you. So. Other thoughts on this particular question of wrestle? And if not, I'll move to challenge. All right, so let's go on then to the challenges that you might have faced. And it could have been the magical thinking, you can do this in 60 to 90 days with no money, or a very vague mandate. So I'll start with you, Professor Raff. what was the challenge, or what is the challenge, if any, that you have been facing? And have you made it through? If so, how did you do that? And if not, what's making it difficult?
How long do you have? So there are many. So one of them that you already cited is the time frame. So we weren't given an unrealistic time frame in the sense that we weren't asked to document a centuries long problem in 60 days. We were given a year and a half. However, we were given a year and a half, but with no decision on our funding until 6 months into it. So people had all these grand ideas about what kind of things that we might want to do, but we're kind of completely in limbo because you can't make decisions without having a budget. So that's one thing. That budget issue has been thankfully resolved. And now we can kind of revisit those questions about how we want to spend money. And there are, of course, differing opinions about that. Another kind of problem that we had, and that I'm curious about the other members of the group, we had a very vague mandate. It was to bring greater truth and reconciliation related to African Americans and Native Americans. In what ways? There was a bunch of data that was shared at the meeting that ultimately led to the resolution that created our commission, mentioning a range of issues, from people reporting kind of disparities in police treatment, to disparities in house ownership, to disparities in wealth and income, to disparities in educational attainment, among kind of Black versus versus white citizens of the borough. Those are just all those are all really, really huge issues. And to make any progress on them required, quite a good bit of time. And our commission was designedly only 7 members. And so this made things extraordinarily difficult. A last thing that I'll mention, because I said I could just continue talking about problems for quite a while. And we were still kind of in the midst of kind of narrowing down our focus. The last thing has been, we've had some attrition in our commission. And the issue of attrition is something that we have learned in serving on this commission that kind of plagues a lot of different bodies within our town. It's an interesting place in that it's a small town with an inordinate number of institutions of higher learning and a lot of things that come along with that. But what that means is that there are a lot of very, very qualified people in this really small town, and many of them kind of seek greener pastures to go elsewhere. And so we have lost members of our commission to doing new illustrious things in other places, in Boston and Chicago and what have you. And so that has been a trouble. And we've learned that that's not just a trouble with our commission, that's been a trouble on the police force as well. And so we're kind of noticing this as an issue and trying to combat it.
All right, wow. So yeah, it's hard to have a group in a sense of a group working together and cohesively if people are moving in and out of it quite often, right? Okay. Let me go ahead and does anybody else want to chime in here? Otherwise, I'll ask the next question. Anybody want to talk about a specific challenge you think that it would be helpful for people to hear that are listening in? Okay, so Judge Freeman, all the folks on this call are on this in this meeting have been engaging the public in different ways and made participation really a priority. So Raff, you've talked about the Thinking About Race series that's in Carlisle, and Anusha, you did the Borough, your group really worked at the Borough level with community engagement there. And then there's been this emphasis of storytelling in Minnesota. And other commissions, a couple other commissions that we've been tracking are using StoryCorps. So I'm starting to hear more and more about the kind of the StoryCorps framework. So are there any special considerations that need to be underscored, particularly around working within communities that have been historically marginalized? What are some of the ethics of giving voice to people? And so for participants that are in the design phase of this process, so they're thinking about doing some of this work, what are the lessons that you've learned so far, Judge? Or what has your group really identified as key priorities when you're collecting stories? I know you're going to connect them to data points, but the process itself of going in and collecting stories. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think when you hope that you can all reach a consensus around a problem and want to solve it, we think it's going to be a lot simpler than it is. And what I mean by that is you think everybody's got a story because the data is so vast and all of these statistics are out there, but not everybody wants to share their story with you and how you want to receive it and all of those things. So I think one critical thing that we learned in this process and are continuing to learn as we go is storytelling takes time. It takes actually before the storytelling a relationship, and a relationship can't be developed without trust. And so especially when you think of an advisory committee like ours, which is comprised of people who work within the system, within the communities and all of those things. So it's like, hey, yes, you've been wronged by this system. Please come and tell people who work in the system how you have been wronged. What? It's a process that you really have to consciously think about and intentionally deal with and address on the front end. And that's been something that we've thought about. And we do have a nice cross section of people on the advisory board who are community leaders and activists who can start that process of building trust by just their buy-in alone and trying to convince their people to say, hey, I'm in this. Please come with me. Let me explain to you this process. And so it's kind of been the snowball effect. And going back to personal encounters and exchanges, I'd also talk about very clearly the fact that this is a trauma process. It is trauma inducing to tell your story. It is a lot to go through. And that if you think that you can go into this because you're a judge and you talk to people for a living and you can go and take one of these stories like it's no big deal, and you're fooling yourself. That's just the practical reality of it. We're trying to work on making sure that the people who will be doing the interviews for getting the storytelling, they will be trained on how to do that. We're hoping to have psychologists or social workers present during some of our storytelling, if not all, to make sure people have the resources, because you have to have a care package ready to deal with and address the trauma that you are ultimately asking people to dig up and deal with. And so that has all been a part of what we've been talking about and what we hope to gather during this process. And that's what our storytelling committee or subcommittee has been trying to develop during this time, because it's hard. It is really hard. And also know it's not going to happen overnight. Yes, this was unlike anything else, right? With what has happened over the last couple of years and some of our lifetimes, this amount of uprising, if you will. It's not the most that's have ever happened in life, but it is something that is certainly different. But how do you take advantage of it without also not taking advantage of people and their feelings? It's such an interesting process to go through, but that's what our work group has really been focusing on, and making sure that we're doing what we can to develop appropriate protocols and procedures to ensure that this story collection process is not traumatic for the people involved, or if it is going to be traumatic, that we can help lift them up at the end with the appropriate resources and services.
I think the main Wabanaki process, there's some wonderful, they've done a lot of work on the ethics of collecting stories and also working with the university to archive them in a way that's honoring to the story itself. How do we keep those stories alive? I know they're doing that out in California as well, but really spent a lot of time around the ethics of story collection and story listening and creating spaces that are safe. So thank you for sharing that. So you really are talking about the issue of, one of the issues is trust. And it seems to me all of these efforts that you've been engaged rely on trust in different kinds of ways. So maybe just really briefly, a couple of you, could you share with us if there have been fault lines of trust that have been inside your process? Could you tell us about what those fault lines are, where that weakness is, or where trust and distrust has played a role in your work? I'll just open it up to anyone.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and share here. This is an incredibly important topic, especially for government initiated initiatives. In New York City, there's all the reason for folks to think, oh, this is just another announcement, capitalizing on the moment. They're not really going to follow through on it. Why should I want to engage? The folks had every reason to think all of those things. But what really helped us was the commission itself and the commissioners. So the commission was composed of people with deep relationships in communities. Many of them working with community-based organizations, longtime advocates, even the ones that work within government, very good relationships and deep relationships across the city. And when we did the public engagement, they really showed up to authentically listen. And, I think folks felt that and knew, whatever comes out of this is a really unique space where folks who are representing something in relation to government are here to listen. And so, the commissioners themselves and what they all represent, I'd say was a takeaway of, something that worked well for us. And, also during our public engagement, and this gets into the ethics of storytelling, but also recognizing the energies of people, especially folks working on the ground in grassroots organizations. They're very busy, don't want to assume that people are going to show up to meetings. And so you have to make it easy. You have to meet people where they're at. So we had big public meetings where people could come out and testify, but we also did behind the scenes interviews, focus groups, meetings, and you have to make sure you do your research. Don't ask folks to repeat things that are already out there, that they've already been very public about. And we also recognize, we're in the middle of the pandemic, and, some people are not going to have the energy to engage. Life is tough. So, I think we're just very thankful of anyone who did engage in any way, whether it was online in a meeting or whatnot. But, those are some things that work for us, and some things that continue to come up, including making everything we did as accessible as possible. And, especially everything that we did online.
Okay, so legitimacy, authenticity, meeting people where they are, going to them, being prepared, being realistic. Those are some tips for those of you that are thinking about doing this work. Other ideas? Sorry.
I have a question for Miss, I know I'm not going to get your pronunciation correct, Venkatraman. You know who I'm talking about. I'm really curious, and I'm going to go to the website to get a fuller sense. But how do you do this in a city of 8 million people and get the kind of I'm just trying to put my arms around that.
Yeah, I mean, New York City is a huge city in totality, but it's lots of communities. And I think in terms of the composition of the commission, they came from geographically different parts of the city, different communities. We needed to keep track of, okay, we're having a meeting here, we're having a meeting there, we're engaging with groups in these communities, but also these sectors. So, a lot of keeping track of how and who you're engaging. But, it really is, I think, like any city, any community, just lots of smaller communities within it. But it definitely takes a lot more resources. Absolutely.
And they got Raff, they were given resources up front. Unlike you. All right.
Not a crazy amount of resources, but yes.
But they persevere and they have some resources. All right. So we're gonna shift a little bit, and I'll probably still try to weave in some of the questions that we were going to ask because they align with some of the questions coming in from the audience here. But one of them, I'm reframing what the person in the audience said, but so the title of the symposium is Rethinking Systems Design, focused on truth, justice, and reconciliation in action. So in your opinion, what needs rethinking? As you have learned, the lived experience about a design that you have been a part of, what kind of practical guidance can you give people that are in the design phase? They are thinking about creating these things that you haven't already shared. Any ideas there?
There is definitely a lot of upfront thinking that has to happen. You know, I won't say it takes forever, but it's just not jumping on a process because it exists as a possibility. And I think this goes to my earlier point that especially, you know, people in this country get very excited about the latest thing, the possibility thing. And, you know, we're dealing, as we've all said, with centuries-long issues. And whether this particular process will work in a community as large as New York City or as small as Carlisle, just a lot of upfront thinking through, not a mandate, not you know, an assertion, but just really, of course, resources matter too. But you know, that's one of my takeaways, having been involved in you know, the process of trying to think about creating a commission. We don't even have the commission yet, but thinking about what it might take. So there were a lot of lessons learned in that.
I'd add, I think one of the things we thought about in our program, and in particular on our advisory committee, is whose voice is not being heard and who is it that we are trying to reach. And so I think if you start having those dialogues about who should be at this table and they're not here, yet we're trying to do something that we think might benefit them or their group or have an impact on a particular government entity or something along those lines, that was really beneficial, because when you get a lot of people around the table and you start talking about, well, what's missing here, who's missing, what the idea is, and having that dialogue was really helpful. And so I would make sure that people are challenging themselves to have those difficult conversations about maybe we messed up and forgot something. The other piece I would say is start off with a plan and then realize your whole plan might need to change. Because if you get so narrowly focused in trying to achieve something, you will be lost in the process. So just be open to the possibility of modification.
Wonderful. I'll just make a quick comment. I read the paper that you all submitted, Judge, and in one of the lines, it's really stood out to me. It says we could not and should not substitute our judgment for that of the broader community, right?
That's exactly right.
Right. And so you have, and my opening was, and then you have to hold it really lightly, because it is going to, if you really want it to be a participatory process, it has to be adaptive, because you don't actually know what people are thinking and feeling and needing. And so back to, you know, like all of, you know, like how do you hold this process carefully, safely, but where there's agility so I think that's a big design question that we need to wrestle with. Right.
You know, I would use the term design as a particular language, but I do think it needs to be a strategic process. So I like the term, I mean, it goes into this idea of vision and what are we trying to get to and how we're trying to get there. And it sounds to me like, in hearing the testimony from everyone on the panel, there are multiple ways to get at this, but having a deep sense of who your community is, how it moves, who the people are, to build that strategic direction. And I think, you know, part of the failure, if you will, of some of the change efforts in this country is because we haven't had that kind of deeply rooted strategic sense of we're here now and how are we going to get there, through what route, and who's going to be involved. And that goes back to, you know, giving some thought to this. And I did see that although our time was too short, we were about ready to really dig at that second level when our charge was done. So, that gives you a kind of sense of the terrain. It is a long-term terrain. There's something in our recommendations that said something minimally about a commission that would minimally take about 7 years to carry out the work of the process. So anyway, throw that in the mix. Strategy.
Well, and I think you're naming something that is really a balancing act, because there's an immediate demand. People are suffering right here, right now, and they want to see change now. And what you're saying is, it can't happen like this. This has to be a very deliberate process. We have to sit long there with one another to actually understand what it is we need to be dealing with. So you have these competing demands. I'm guessing some of you have faced that similar kind of tension of competing demands. And so how do you do both? Is it possible to do both?
Well, you definitely have to think dialectically about it. I don't think it's an either or a binary. There are moments in the longer term that some immediate things can happen, but always with an eye on the bigger vision. So that would be the only way I could respond to the urgency of the moment, while understanding that it's going to take a while. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat that came through, and the question is, public officials have played a range of roles. They apologize, they acknowledge harms, they convene, they render reparations. How should they play all of these roles, or should they be playing these roles, in your opinion? And what roles can and should public figures, and they could be government officials or other kinds of officials, what roles can and should they play?
I think it depends. Oh, sorry, Judge.
Oh, I was just going to say, I try to talk less in these kinds of things because, judges, we talk too much. But as a public official who is here and can talk about it, one of the reasons I am involved in the system is because I am a firm believer in infiltrating from within rather than from outside. And I think there are other people who feel the opposite, that the system is so broken that you must reform it from the exterior, right? And my hope is that both are happening concurrently so that we actually can effectuate true change. So I feel like the answer is it depends to the question, which is, where is the heart of the public official to whom you are talking about? Is it someone who is riding on the coattails of what they think is trendy right now, which is maybe equity and reparations and reconciliation? We all know some folks like that, right? Who are doing it because right now it's in vogue. We can just be honest. It just is. But then there are other folks who legitimately want to change things and move that continuum and that envelope. And I would hopefully think that everybody that I work with would say that about me. I know that's my goal as a public official. And I hope that that kind of change happens when you have that force from inside, from outside, and all around building. I think they all have a place at the table. We just have to decide how to build the blocks together rather than apart.
I think it's really interrogating that there are different, I guess it's a technical term, theories of change. How do we believe change is really going to take place? Well, we can't afford one theory of change. It probably needs, a lot of things need to be happening at the same time. Some things should be deconstructed or raised to the ground, while others, it is a bottom up and inside out kind of process. So,
well, one thing we do know is that this process got catalyzed in the midst of a tremendous mass upsurge. And most of the social movement history I'm aware of says that's the pattern that follows, that the policy tends to, if it fundamentally incurs a degree of change, comes heavily from the bottom up, and then the policymakers respond. And I mean, there's a lot of evidence for that. Nobody can really point to, well, we'll just go back a quick moment. To the history of this country, there was not a lot of volunteerism to ending enslavement. It takes a fight And, this is not just an opinion. It's not off the top of my head. It's what we understand about how social movements happen in the world. And I think we should keep that in mind. And no doubt, without Johnson signing those 64 and 65 voting and the other act, probably would have been at a different place. But there was a big civil rights movement behind that pushed it forward. So yeah, we can go back and forth on the chicken and the egg, but the evidence is pretty clear, at least in this country. So I just
Okay. All right, I'm going to ask one last question, and Anusha and Amber, I'm going to kind of pivot to the two of you, because I do want to talk about systems level change. A lot of people talk about systems, we got to change systems, but I think it's very difficult to change a system for all sorts of reasons. And yet I think it's critical that systems are changed. So why is that important? Why and in what ways strategically did your efforts go after systems? What kind of subtle strategies or overt strategies did you use to really begin to unbuckle those baked in patterns of systems versus a policy? Like Anusha, you made the distinction between a policy and the system itself. So let's start with you, Anusha, and then we'll go over to Amber and learn a little bit about the strategies you used in your process as well.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for the question. Super important one. We as empowered as a charter revision commission saw that, okay, this is the written document that lays out what the system in New York City is. Of course, there's systems and structural things that go beyond the city level that impact us greatly. And there are things that may not necessarily be written down, but this is a place that we can start to look at the systems or the structures that by design, implementation, or impact perpetuate inequities, allow them to continue, make it easy for people to let them continue. It's really interesting how the system has its own inertia. And this, I was thinking about this when we were talking about public officials too. The system wants to continue being and doing what it is, but people also let it do that and uphold it and, take both active and proactive and passive ways to let that go on. And so it is really interesting throughout the process to look at the appetite for even just risk taking. Folks might see, yes, these things need to change, but I don't know, it's really big. Is this the right thing to do? There's wrestling with like what it takes to actually make and do systems level or structural change. We also wrestled with, what is structural change? It can sound so abstract, but what are we really talking about here? And where we landed is that we wanted to put forward proposals that didn't just change a single agency's policy or very specific policies, but really looked across the map and started in the direction of changing what the system could look like into the future, because it is a long process, one that we know that we just barely, begun over this past year, but it must continue. And there must be accountability mechanisms in place to make sure it continues so that folks don't get comfortable and allow the system to just run itself.
Well, and your chair was very clear. Man, she kept bringing it back. If there was a little bit of, drift, she's like, no, we're going to root causes. We're going back to structure. She said that over and over. So she had real clarity around the focus of that work.
Yeah.
Which I think
we
really
spent a lot of time in the early months, like really honing in on that and like thinking about what do we mean by structural change? I don't even remember the definitions that we came up with. It certainly was like a lot of work for staff and commission, but I think it helped in making sure we were all in the same
Hi, Rebecca.
place. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think having clarity around your goal, and that was mentioned earlier this morning, she was clear and she helped keep that train on the track. Amber, we've just got a couple more minutes. We have been delighted watching the subtle ways in which you were able to affect structure. And so if you could just describe that a little bit more to those listening in, I think that would be really helpful.
I think for us, it was really helpful that our local college of Charleston, they created a disparities report for the city or our tri-county area. And we were able to take that report and pull from it. And that's how we kind of created our 7 subcommittees, looking at the disparities that they found in their report. So we knew that there were disparities in criminal justice, in healthcare, education, and we had the data to support that coming from that report. So we were able to pull from that and then divide our work that way, and then also connect those subcommittees to our city departments. So it's not only connected to our community members, but how do we connect it to the work that we're doing internally? So we're able to bridge those gaps that way. And then since the report has been released, our community organizations that work in those different areas have been able to pull those recommendations and then ask the questions, how can they help? Help us help the city build capacity in those areas, because we know that we can't necessarily make changes in all of those areas because we don't have the staff or the resources to do all of the work that were recommended in those recommendations. So just building across our community organizations and then the city internally, that's how we've been able to move forward with those recommendations.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that also that the way you populated the commission itself, you had almost 50% were council members, standing council members. So they were very aware of what was happening inside that commission. And then they also kind of went and listened in on your subcommittees, and then they pulled key city officials or representatives or organizations into those subcommittees. So it's very similar, Judge Freeman, to what you have in your advisory committee. You have really top level people who have a very large, long stretch into different organizations. And I think that is one important step that we can take if we're going to try to undertake systemic and structural changes, that we have the right people who can do that within organizations that we're trying to impact. All right, so it's time for us to go, and I'm so sorry that we have to do this, but any last words that anybody just has a burning, you really want to make sure you say something before I thank you and say goodbye to this session? Raff?
Yeah, I want to, there was a question that got asked and we didn't get to answer, which was about national interest in the groups. And one thing that our group has been doing, in part because of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, is trying to think about how that space can be something that people can experience and learn about their history. And what's been really interesting is that for the first time, the Department of the Interior Secretary is a Native person. And they've actually done a visit to the school since being appointed. And what we were hoping for, though, has not yet happened. We're hoping that there might be some connection between our town and the Interior Department on this issue and trying to make this space, which is owned by the federal government, be available so people can learn about their history in our town. That's just a quick thing I wanted to mention, and hope that I can report in the future that that has occurred.
Anyone else? All right, so Anusha, Ember, Professor Donaldson, Professor Brewer, and Judge Freeman, thank you. We appreciate taking the time to share your work. I think a bit of your heart, what you've been learning, and just for encouraging others that are involved in these efforts. I think we need each other. We need to learn. We need to, it opens up our imaginations when people start sharing what they're doing. I think we need to build strong networks and coalitions and to actually experience from one another inclusion and collaboration and sharing. I think we model that then when we are engaged in this kind of way. And so I think we did that today, and I'm just so grateful, and all of us are grateful. So thank you. And at this point, I think I'm going to say goodbye to all of you and turn the session back over to Bill